At 02:12 hours, March 19, 1944, the first line of American bombers crossed the invisible seam between safety and certainty. Beneath them, the North Sea moved in slow, indifferent swells, dark and flat like sheet metal under moonlight. Above them, the sky carried no stars, only a thin veil of cloud that bled faint grey over the horizon. Inside each cockpit, breath condensed in pale bursts that vanished against cockpit glass already frosted by altitude and cold. This was the corridor no aircraft survived without being seen. The crews called it the Black Corridor. It existed between the last British coastal beacon and the first reach of German radar, a stretch of air that measured just under 100 miles and consumed more Allied lives than anti-aircraft artillery or night fighters combined. It was where formations entered enemy oversight, where every pulse of metal and vibration became a signal on a screen inside concrete bunkers far to the east. Once inside, the process was automatic. Detection, plotting, vectoring, interception, impact. German Freya radar stations, fixed along the coast from Denmark to the Low Countries, cast overlapping search cones into the sky. Each rotating antenna swept a circle of airspace wide enough to detect bomber formations at ranges approaching 90 miles. Closer inland, Würzburg stations supplied tracking precision. These systems could lock onto a single aircraft at distances close to 30 miles, calculating altitude and speed with enough accuracy to guide interceptors into direct gun alignment. Together, they formed a continuous detection chain, a wall invisible to the eye but absolute in effect. By the opening months of 1944, bomber loss rates during penetration averaged one aircraft every 2 minutes. Entire squadrons disappeared without seeing enemy fighters. Crews learned to measure progress in seconds survived rather than miles flown. A man might board a Liberator over Lincolnshire before dawn and never reach the German coastline. Others reached the target only to vanish on the return path, their absence marked by empty rectangles on formation diagrams and delayed silence on squadron rosters. Inside German command centers, the sequence unfolded with mechanical discipline. A Freya station registered first contact. Operators marked a glowing trace. The signal moved west to east. A controller issued coordinates. A Würzburg array tightened the lock. Vectors transmitted to night fighter airfields. Pilots scrambled, climbed, intercepted, and closed. The entire process could complete within 7 minutes from initial detection. The bomber crews understood the chain. They understood it could not be outrun. It did not matter how tight the formation flew. It did not matter how steadily the pilots held altitude. Radar saw through darkness, through cloud, through the absence of moonlight. It saw the thrum of engines and the solid distortion of aluminum against the night sky. It saw every aircraft as a bright echo, a mathematical certainty, and that echo meant death was already in motion. First Lieutenant Robert H. Sinclair understood the corridor better than most. 31 years old. 197 flight hours logged in the B-24 Liberator. He did not operate guns. He did not sight bombs. His duties lay folded into a narrower field that most pilots barely understood. He was assigned as an experimental electronic countermeasures officer under the 8th Air Force, tasked not with destroying targets, but confusing the devices that guided others to destroy him. Sinclair sat at a narrow station behind the cockpit, lit only by the dull green glow of an oscilloscope. The screen whispered with its own static rhythm. Needles trembled. Lines flickered. A low hum vibrated through every rivet in the fuselage. His gloved fingers rested on sealed containers mounted beside his seat, each one locked, numbered, and authorized only for live operational trial. Outside his viewport, the night looked no different than any other. Inside, the situation was precision-defined. 300 bombers were threading through enemy detection space. They would be in the corridor for exactly 90 minutes. 90 minutes of exposure. 90 minutes during which German radar could detect, classify, vector, and destroy them in sequence. The operational stakes did not allow abstraction. If German radar saw them, bombers would fall. If bombers fell, crews would die. If crews died, the mission would fail. The mission was not theoretical. The mission demanded results measured in steel production, shipyard output, and locomotive derailment capability. The mission demanded that the enemy not see what was already overhead. That was Sinclair's function. Prevent seeing. Corrupt signal fidelity. Break the detection chain. Produce enough confusion that the radar screens ceased to represent reality. For months, Allied engineers had tried traditional solutions. Increased altitude, irregular flight paths, radio silence, tighter formations. None reduced loss rates. Radar adapted. Radar recalibrated. Radar updated. Sinclair worked with a different premise. Radar did not see aircraft. Radar saw reflections. The machine did not know what it was looking at. It only returned what physics allowed. And physics could be deceived. His assignment was designated temporary, classified, and experimental. He was told in simple terms, make German radar blind for as long as possible. Blind long enough that the enemy could not sort truth from shadow. Blind long enough that the bomber stream passed without interception or pursuit. The margin was narrow. Failure meant annihilation in sequence, one after another, until the formation no longer existed. The corridor swallowed sound. The engines droned. The craft flexed against turbulence. The air, inside the fuselage, dropped below freezing. Metal creaked under strain. Sinclair checked his release intervals again, his timing device aligned to precise mechanical intervals, 12 seconds per cycle. Each movement measured, each moment charted. Forward of him, the pilot held level flight through absolute darkness. To the right, the North Sea vanished into void. To the east, Germany waited behind its hidden walls of wavelength and echo. The corridor had claimed thousands before him. It did not care for rank, or precision, or preparation. It functioned without bias. Within this corridor, only invisibility meant survival, and Sinclair was about to test whether invisibility could be manufactured. Note: all numbers and years written in full words. At 02:26 hours, the Liberator held course along the pre-calculated corridor, a narrow ribbon of airspace selected to exploit the weakest overlap between German early warning stations. Beneath Sinclair's position, the radar compartment hummed with steady mechanical resolve. The SCR-720 receiver, cycling through frequencies with methodical indifference. The vibration of 4 Pratt & Whitney radial engines transmitted through the fuselage in consistent pulses, measured, predictable. A reminder that the true danger did not come from flak or fighters yet, but from invisible wavelengths slicing through the night. German radar doctrine relied upon layered detection, an interlocking net designed to deny surprise. Freya stations extended outward from the coastline in a staggered arc, each with detection capability exceeding 90 nautical miles in optimal conditions. Würzburg towers, more precise but shorter ranged, locked onto individual returns and translated raw signal echoes into actionable vectors for night fighter control. The bomber stream did not simply fly toward Germany. It penetrated a system that had been refined through 2 years of operational warfare. Mathematical, rehearsed, unforgiving. Sinclair understood this environment as a problem of signal behavior, not air combat. Radar operated on the principle of time delay between emission and reflection. A transmitted pulse struck an object and returned as echo. The elapsed time established distance. The coherence of the signal identified structure. If coherence could be fractured, if timing could be disrupted, then reality itself could be distorted on an operator's screen. The solution lay within the bundles secured behind him. 36 units of reflective countermeasures, each calibrated to the precise wavelength of German Würzburg systems. Aluminized foil strips, cut to half wavelength intervals, engineered not for concealment, but for deception. They did not hide aircraft. They manufactured aircraft, artificial signatures capable of mimicking entire bomber groups drifting in impossible geometry. As Sinclair prepared the second deployment cycle, the Liberator pierced a region where detection probability had previously reached near certainty. Analysis from prior raids indicated that this corridor accounted for nearly 1/3 of sustained losses during penetration timing alone. Crews transiting this zone faced interception rates in excess of 50% before even reaching operational altitude over the Reich. The radio operator nearer the midsection leaned back briefly, eyes fixed forward. No commentary followed. In disciplined silence, each man understood their trajectory. They passed into the zone where German controllers typically completed their first confirmed plots, where night fighter squadrons launched with direct heading and altitude engagement instructions. On Sinclair's screen, his own emissions displayed unstable, jittering lines as chaff deployment began to shape the electromagnetic environment. The first false return bloomed in heavy amplitude, then a second, then 5 more. Each burst landed precisely within the time-separated signal windows calculated during Sinclair's training sessions with British signal engineers months prior. Across the coast, German observers reacted through drilled protocol. Bearings were called, distances updated, sectors highlighted. Fighter control relayed confusing plots to their intercept formations, clusters overlapping, vectors contradicting one another, returns shifting course as if defying aerodynamic logic. The system processed the data as real until statistical coherence collapsed. But collapsing required time, and time was the only margin Sinclair needed. Within this sliver of mechanical uncertainty, the bomber stream moved undetected, engines maintaining constant revolutions per minute, navigation executed through dead reckoning and chronometric discipline. No flares, no deviation, no radios. Only steady progress through a corridor that could no longer be seen by those tasked with eliminating it. Sinclair adjusted release timing by 3 seconds, compensating for changes in wind velocity and altitude drift. Each alteration precisely documented, range distortion measured, echo density analyzed. He spoke once, a clipped procedural note to the navigator. Cycle adjusted. Maintain course. The navigator acknowledged. Nothing more. No confirmation required. German night fighters ascended through artificial formations, their onboard sets echoing confused returns. Pilots vectored towards spectral targets that dispersed as quickly as they assembled. Fuel burned. Ammunition conservatively expended. Time consumed by ghosts. By the time the first actual bomber crossed coastal boundaries, radar coherence had degraded into fragmented noise. Plot boards held contradictory tracking trails. Observers issued new bearings that overlapped previous warnings. Fighter controllers hesitated. Hesitation introduced fragmentation. Fragmentation introduced failure. For Sinclair, the outcome was measured not by emotion but by data. He logged amplitude drift. He recorded coherence decay. He noted average, signal-to-noise deviation exceeding predicted tolerance thresholds. His clipboard bore no reference to danger, only function. Outside the aircraft, the horizon dissolved into uniform darkness. Below, the sea reflected nothing. Above, contrails formed faint ribbons of condensed vapor marking passage through enemy airspace unnoticed. In later debriefings, engineers would analyze that night as the first large-scale confirmation that radar itself could be manipulated with sufficient precision. That detection systems did not perceive truth. They interpreted patterns that could be fabricated. In that corridor, still officially designated as a breakthrough vector, no aircraft was lost. No interception achieved firing distance. No enemy pilot established visual contact on the primary formation. The corridor held, and for one timed interval measured not in courage, but in reflection, the Luftwaffe's most advanced sensor network witnessed reality unravel beneath artificial echoes designed by a silent officer who understood that the air war could be decided not by speed or altitude, but by mathematics alone. Note: all numbers and years written in full words. At 0352 hours, the bomber stream reached the midpoint of the crossing corridor, a section historically associated with maximum interception density and minimum survival probability. Statistical charts maintained by 8th Air Force Operations recorded this zone as the point where mechanical advantage routinely shifted from navigation discipline to enemy prediction. It was here that most formations fractured. It was here that radio silence failed. It was here that crews spoke less and calculated more. On Sinclair's scope, the electromagnetic environment appeared saturated beyond practical interpretation. False returns multiplied faster than operators could annotate. Drift vectors overlapped. Reflection arcs folded into one another. The scope did not portray chaos. It portrayed excess. Too much information to resolve. Too many objects to classify. The single greatest weakness of radar lay not in inaccuracy, but in overload. Sinclair exploited this feature deliberately. Radar could not function when forced to resolve simultaneous signals beyond its computational logic. Every additional bundle of chaff amplified the problem geometrically. He released the third deployment cluster at an interval shortened by 1 second, forcing false formations to converge more tightly along simulated approach vectors. From a German operator's perspective, the airspace was now filled with aircraft violating conventional flight geometry. Squadrons appeared to merge, dissolve, separate again, none adhering to predictable physics. In the interceptor control bunkers along the coast, tension grew measurable, procedural, contained. Plotters spoke in clipped cadence. Multiple concentrations, unable correlate, bearing unstable. A senior controller ordered altitude interpolation based on weighted averages, attempting to impose logic where logic had been removed. Night fighter crews climbed through pre-designated ceiling layers, expecting firm vectors. Instead, directions fluctuated. Heading revisions issued every 30 seconds. Fuel curves recalculated. The pilots adjusted trim and throttle as if chasing a formation that existed only inside distorted bandwidth. Inside the Liberator, no such confusion existed. Course held constant, instruments steady, airspeed 214 miles per hour, altitude stabilized. Sinclair did not glance outside. His reference point existed entirely within signal envelope manipulation. The mission's success relied on maintaining the illusion longer than German computational systems could sustain denial. He initiated the fourth release sequence at exactly 0411 hours, at which point wind shear increased by 4 knots and forced slight drift. The adjustment altered false target course lines by 5 degrees. He compensated without commentary. The navigator marked the correction quietly, his pencil tracing silent arcs on laminated maps. German operators identified one return cluster as a primary threat and vectored a fighter formation toward it. The fighters climbed into empty sky, instrumentation confirming proximity to phantom returns. Guns remained cold, visual confirmation unreached. The formation adjusted again, shifting northward by 12 degrees, burning additional fuel in pursuit of drifting static. The sky appeared occupied. It was not. Meanwhile, the true bombing group crossed perimeter tracking zones without echo detection strong enough to trigger pursuit. Sinclair's engineered ghosts displaced enemy attention until the real formation passed through the center of the grid. Radar did not fail. It obeyed the information provided. That information was fraudulent by design. At 0436 hours, one German operator hesitated. His scope reflected overlapping Doppler inconsistencies. The returns behaved unnaturally. He voiced the concern aloud. These are not consistent with heavy aircraft signatures. The statement registered. The classification process began its slow re-evaluation. However, by the time the analysis cycle reached confirmation stage, the real bombers had already progressed deeper inland. Sinclair marked the moment on his log. Coherence degrading. Effect sustained. He authorized the fifth deployment cycle to further dilute clarity. His intention was not merely to blind but to delay. Delay created misalignment. Misalignment created failure. Failure preserved aircraft. In parallel channels, intelligence teams later noted that Luftwaffe controllers delayed issuing direct fighter intercept orders for nearly 12 minutes during this window, uncertain which of the formations represented the true intrusion. That delay represented the survival interval required for 300 aircraft to clear the danger zone. The bomber crew remained unaware of specific outcomes. They perceived none of the mechanical seduction unfolding across the electromagnetic spectrum. Their environment remained defined by cold airflow, faint oxygen hiss, and cyclic vibration of metal under stress. For them, there was no phantom sky, only operational silence. By 05:23 hours, first indications of coastline penetration failure reached remaining Würzburg stations. Operators recalibrated frequency outputs, widening filter bands to compensate for distortion. This modification narrowed detection sensitivity and diluted range resolution. The earlier clarity disappeared permanently for the remainder of the operation. Sinclair observed the effect through return decay. His scope no longer depicted structured targets. The airspace had transitioned from mapped geometry into digital haze. He noted peak interference saturation and ceased deployment. A resource conserved. A record completed. This phase marked the precise moment when German detection transitioned from functional instrument to statistical guesswork. The system remained active. It continued to emit, but it no longer provided meaningful targeting solutions fast enough to support interception. Behind the Liberator, the artificial formations dissolved slowly, strips dispersing into lower altitudes, returning control of the sky to natural physics and ordinary interpretation. Yet, the residue of confusion remained within operator perception. Real aircraft now carried the same ambiguity as the ghosts that preceded them. Sinclair remained methodical. He rotated his posture, recorded every variable. Temperature differential at altitude, drift curve analysis, signal echo variability. All numbers placed in controlled notation, preparing for analysis that would shape doctrine long after this raid concluded. 3 hours later, the bombers released their payload onto industrial targets without losing coherence. Precision achieved. Pathfinding accurate. Enemy response delayed. The corridor had not survived by altitude, nor by speed, nor by retaliation fire. It survived by uncertainty. Designed, executed, measured. And within that spectrum lay the invitation for a new kind of air war, one not ruled by the visibility of objects, but the manipulation of recognition itself. All numbers and years written in full words. At 05:48 hours, the last measurable coherence between German coastal radar stations and the primary bomber formation dissolved into static dispersion. The once continuous chain of detection, built upon overlapping arcs of calculated observation, fractured into isolated interruptions incapable of sustaining meaningful correlation. From this point forward, German controllers were reacting not to structure, but to ambiguity. Within the Würzburg control stations, operators recalculated scanning frequencies and increased gain thresholds. This amplified background noise rather than returning clarity. The effect resembled a field of echoes, without origin. Returns jittered, bearings could not be reconciled. Velocity tracking collapsed into estimation. The detection net had not simply been bypassed, it had been destabilized from within. Sinclair did not adjust posture. He adjusted parameters. His corrections remained incremental, systematic. He extended deployment cycle intervals to preserve residual illusion without saturating the chaff density beyond effective range. Too much reflection would reveal artificiality. Too little would permit recalibration. The margin remained narrow. He maintained it through disciplined interval timing and minor angular compensation. Below and behind his position, The artificial formations dispersed vertically, creating layered distortion fields that resembled multiple altitude returns. To a German controller, bomber groups appeared to occupy altitude bands that conflicted with established formation doctrine. The data violated expectation, and expectation governed response time. Each cycle of disbelief delayed action. At 06:15 hours, one fighter formation reported visual contact with projected targets and confirmed no aircraft present. The pilot's tone was precise, unemotional. The confirmation triggered an internal review procedure, but such procedures required coordination between separate command nodes. That coordination consumed minutes. The raid consumed seconds. The main bomber stream crossed its first inland waypoint without sustained opposition. Flak defenses remained active but incomplete, uncoordinated by effective early warning cues. Anti-aircraft batteries elevated barrels toward predicted vectors that never materialized. Shell bursts occupied empty air. The true formation moved beyond their predictive envelopes before recalibration could be achieved. Inside the Liberator, the crew felt none of this reconfiguration. Their experience remained constant. Vibration, controlled altitude adjustments, oxygen masks whispering rhythmically against breath patterns. The only visual record of systemic collapse existed within Sinclair's scope, now reflecting diminished amplitude returns and erratic signal behavior beyond correction threshold. He marked the moment. Operational collapse confirmed. Then reoriented his attention toward persistence. The corridor must remain blind long enough for extraction. 90 minutes defined success. Failure would arrive when German networks regrouped and reasserted structure. Sinclair verified residual inventory. Remaining bundles within secure tolerance limits. 12 units preserved. Capable of generating one final saturation layer if required. Yet premature deployment risked pattern exposure. He deferred, choosing to let confusion degrade further through natural dispersion delay rather than immediate amplification. German fighter control attempted a structural reset. Secondary posts engaged independent scans, mobile radar trucks activated frequency alternates, even emergency optic observation posts were queued to report visual anomalies. The system sought substitutes for a network it no longer trusted. Those substitutes lacked integration. Night fighter pilots circled overhead, constrained by fuel consumption and ambiguous guidance. Directional advisories conflicted. Northward shifts contradicted southern vectors. Altitude estimates fluctuated by margins exceeding operational tolerance. Every correction consumed distance and opportunity. The momentum of interception dissipated. At 06:39 hours, one Würzburg unit regained brief contact on a spectral cluster drifting northwest. The plot appeared coherent for 30 seconds. Then, fractured. It was the decay of Sinclair's final deployment 10 minutes earlier. The false formation exited perimeter scan radius and dissolved beyond tracking threshold. A threat that had never existed completed its illusionary journey. Only after its passing did German command reorient attention toward suppressed detection sectors. Too late. By this time, the bomber formation had already completed its ingress phase and transitioned into interior airspace beyond rapid response capability. Sinclair authorized release of 2 remaining bundles at extended interval as a deterrent measure. The effect restored partial haze along perimeter interfaces, anchoring residual confusion behind the formation's withdrawal path. Not concealment, obfuscation. The collapse of the detection net was not sudden. It unfolded across cycles of system failure where each feedback adjustment worsened internal contradiction. Engineers would later identify this phenomenon as cumulative interference saturation. At the time, it felt indistinguishable from blindness. On the ground, commanders issued terse adjustments to operational doctrine. Detection unreliable, intercept uncertain. Such phrases appeared in operational log margins without embellishment. Their significance lay in implication. The Luftwaffe's defining advantage had been neutralized not through counterforce, but through arithmetic distortion. In the cockpit, Sinclair remained procedural. He logged intervals, ensured proper equipment function, monitored stabilization rates. No gesture indicated recognition of scale. His focus remained defined by process. Process preserved lives. The bomber formation now carried the illusion of invisibility into German interior airspace, a deception made possible by an officer whose military contribution would never appear in aerial victory counts. No guns fired. No smoke trailed. Yet entire sections of enemy infrastructure stood unguarded under invisible passage. The detection net had wielded control over half a continent's defensive architecture. Its collapse restructured the geometry of the air campaign fundamentally. German air defense transitioned from certainty to speculation within a single operational hour. Outside, dawn approached the eastern horizon. Light faintly touched cloud edges. The corridor no longer held meaning. The threat had been carried westward. What remained for German radar was residual uncertainty, and for Sinclair, confirmation that reflections could be shaped, sight could be compromised, and certainty could be designed out of existence. At 0743 hours, the bomber stream reached the final approach vector to Bremen's industrial quadrant, a zone mapped under 8th Air Force Reference Grid Delta 7, responsible for the production of precision machine components critical to German naval and armored manufacturing. The approach segment was historically defended by integrated heavy flak positions coordinated by ground radar queuing. On this morning, that coordination had not materialized. The absence of reliable detection translated into delayed elevation commands across anti-aircraft positions. Gun crews received fragmented warnings with insufficient azimuth data. Angles were approximated. Elevation corrections lagged. Shell bursts occurred seconds behind optimal engagement timing. This delay did not eliminate defensive fire, but it fractured its coherence, reducing density and effectiveness. Within the cabin of the Liberator, the bombardier adjusted visual track on the Norden site, aligning grid coordinates marked from precision charts issued during the prior evening briefing. His hands moved slowly, deliberately. He did not comment. The pilot maintained altitude discipline. The navigator confirmed drift corrections based on celestial fixes taken earlier during the transit phase. Sinclair transitioned from signal disruption to monitoring role, observing residual electromagnetic distortion along the periphery of the formation. The artificial returns that had shielded the approach were now thinning, descending toward lower atmospheric strata, dispersing with predictable fall rate and wind vector influence. His objective had shifted, no longer to deceive attack systems, but to ensure they did not reconfigure in time to challenge exit trajectory. Bremen's skyline emerged faintly beneath cloud breaks. Smoke plumes from industrial complexes rose vertically, immune to wind shear at lower altitudes. Visual confirmation replaced instrumental reliance. The moment marked the precise intersection of deception, effectiveness, and operational payload execution. At 0749 hours, the lead bomb group triggered release sequence. The formation responded in timed unison, bomb bay doors opening in sequence across the corridor. Metal mechanisms adjusted. Pressure imbalances corrected. The first payload descended. Then the second. Then entire rows across the formation. Weight reduction altered lift characteristics slightly, corrected through micro-adjustments at the control surfaces. The ground impact followed in rigid sequence. Detonations rippled through the production zone with industrial regularity. Shock waves registered seconds later. Smoke columns expanded, obscuring subsequent sighting opportunities. Structural failure cascaded through assembly warehouses, turbine facilities, and electrical grids aligned to the manufacturing chain. German air defense detected detonation, shock signatures, long before visual confirmation of the origin. Control desks reacted too late. Revised coordinates issued after strikes had already compromised primary assets. The detection vacuum preceding impact rendered counter-battery solution attempts obsolete on arrival. Sinclair observed minor resurgence in return activity to the north. Controllers had re-established fragmented plotting capacity and were attempting to vector interceptor squadrons toward the now retreating formations. However, fatigue from the earlier deception cycle had already consumed response margin. Time lost could not be recovered. Within the bomber formation, radio silence remained. Only vacuum hiss of pressurization and structure vibration defined interior awareness. Each crew member maintained his discipline. No confirmation commentary passed between positions. The payload phase completed at 0802 hours. Bomb bay doors sealed. Aircraft reconfigured for egress vector. The formation tightened. Heading adjusted westward. On German channels, fighter control units attempted pursuit initiation. However, Q resolution degraded continuously. The targets, now departing under residual chaff distortion, generated insufficient coherence for sustained lock. Interceptors arrived too late to influence the central formation's withdrawal path. Sinclair remained methodical. He prepared contingency release bundles in the event of immediate tracking reacquisition. Weather conditions and signal signatures suggested diminishing probability. He chose not to deploy. Restraint preserved efficiency. Excess risked refinement exposure. Far beneath the formation, industrial infrastructure ceased operative function across 6 separate zones. Production capacity disrupted. Tactical advantage achieved through precision alignment and uninterrupted penetration methodology. This phase of silent devastation represented the convergence of calculated deception and mechanized force. Where detection once governed German response cycles, uncertainty now reigned. The absence of interceptor engagement indicated successful lateral dominance of electromagnetic terrain. Sinclair recorded final anomaly patterns before withdrawing equipment for transit. His focus never shifted to visual confirmation. Success was measured through signal silence, not explosion volume. Radar silence indicated mission efficacy. Secondary confirmation arrived through navigational clearance and structural maintenance checks, executed with mechanical continuity. The bomber formation crossed into westward airspace with minimal opposition. Interception failure on such a scale had not been documented since early campaign adaptation months. Tactical reports would define this phase as the first operational validation of sustained radar deception during direct strike penetration. What had once been guarded territory now surrendered under designed invisibility. The silent impact zone served as proof not of destructive capability, but of operational domination, achieved without escalation of force. The German system had not been overpowered. It had been misled. And within that misdirection lay the quiet realization that the future of aerial warfare would depend not on observation, but on the control of what observation believed itself to be seeing. Note: all numbers and years written in full words. At 0836 hours, the bomber stream initiated coordinated withdrawal procedures along the designated egress vector, a calculated path designed to minimize residual exposure to reconstituted German interception capabilities. The aircraft reduced speed marginally. Formation integrity remained constant. The corridor, once an entry zone marked by high attrition metrics, transitioned into a corridor of calculated uncertainty for defenders attempting delayed pursuit. Sinclair monitored partial recovery signals along the rearward quadrant. German systems, though degraded, were not destroyed. Their operators adjusted through emergency recalibration cycles, integrating fresh frequency bands into temporary overlays. The returns that now appeared differed in clarity but lacked reliable continuity. For pursuit aircraft, the solution remained imperfect. The first Luftwaffe night fighters reached predicted intercept grid coordinates at 0851 hours. Their approach, dictated by extrapolated vectors rather than confirmed detection, led them toward empty sky zones once saturated by spectral formations. Contact could not be established. Directional advisories fluctuated. Pilots held orbit, uncertain of formation placement, forced to burn fuel without confirmation threshold. Within the Liberator, the flight engineer adjusted mixture controls to account for fuel variance. Engine revolutions per minute stabilized. Structural vibration remained constant. Interior discipline persisted. No crew commentary deviated from form. The silence possessed operational purpose. Silence permitted continuity. Continuity permitted survival. Sinclair's role remained precision-focused. He rotated his calibration toggle, monitored echo degradation rates, compiled data sequences for future analysis. Detection loss patterns revealed temporal gaps between output signal acquisition and echo return by margins, expanding beyond effective interception tolerance. The longer those margins expanded, the narrower German response capability became. Behind the formation, scattered flak arcs rose from coastal defensive sectors belatedly activated through manual observation. Without integrated radar guidance, these batteries functioned as localized deterrents rather than coordinated threats. Shell bursts punctuated the airspace irregularly, creating visual interference but lacking convergence pattern. At 09:15 hours, a temporary tracking return registered slightly north of the bomber stream. Fighters diverted accordingly. Predictive analysis suggested it represented residual chaff drift rather than actual aircraft signature. Confirmation arrived when intercept pilots failed to establish visual contact. Another direction failure recorded. Another margin preserved. Sinclair withheld his final bundles. The threat environment no longer warranted additional deployment. Risk of detectability outweighed operational gain. The mission's second phase required preservation, not amplification. The navigation team recalculated course correction based on ground speed fluctuation and crosswind adjustment. The formation responded through minor lateral correction, maintaining altitude synchrony across adjacent sections. The visual terrain beneath receded into less industrial topography. The horizon softened toward neutral darkness once more. The German response continued to fragment. Without sustained correlation, command nodes failed to issue coherent strategic direction. Fighters returned to base incrementally, fuel reserves depleted, engagement unattained. Tactical debriefs conducted within those units reflected uncertainty regarding target trajectory and presence. Confusion replaced threat. Sinclair recorded another data point. Post-interception failure duration extending beyond 18 minutes. He underlined it. This metric indicated procedural impairment significant enough to influence future defensive planning. It represented strategic consequence beyond immediate mission integrity. At 09:47 hours, the lead bomber crossed back over maritime coordinates, marking the virtual severance point between contested and neutral airspace. The formation maintained spacing discipline for safety. Structural inspections initiated by onboard engineers revealed minimal damage. Only superficial scrape marks along leading edges. No fatal compromise. No crew loss. The transition to sea removed the final effective engagement risk. German pursuit was abandoned. Silence persisted. The corridor now reversed. What had once been a gate of vulnerability became a passage of restrained withdrawal. Sinclair disengaged his active monitoring equipment, preserving signal memory logs and handwritten annotations for post-flight evaluation. He did not speak. His composure remained procedural. His contribution invisible to most crew members, but essential to all their survival. Ahead of them, friendly airspace awaited, still beyond visual range. The North Sea stretched below in indistinct shadow tones. Dawn light edged faintly along cloud layers, altering contrast perceptions but not mission status. The German air defense network, designed to intercept, track, and destroy, had failed to execute a single confirmed shooting solution during peak vulnerability phase. Such a lapse would demand doctrinal investigation. Such an anomaly would trigger structural review. It had no immediate corrective remedy. As the Prototype aircraft returned to friendly soil approach, The gravity of the alterations seeped into silent awareness. Aircraft returned that, by established predictive ratios, should not have survived the central arc. Yet they had. The return through invisible fire completed the operational illustration. Deception had sustained until removal from threat envelope. The innovation remained efficient not because it eliminated danger, but because it controlled how danger perceived itself. The line between detection and response had been shifted beyond operational reach. For Sinclair, there was no evidence of victory, only stabilization, only sustained control, only preservation of function. The path they traced that morning would later define a recalibrated doctrine. But in this moment, measured by quiet mechanical rhythm and downward engine resonance, the outcome remained unspoken. Survival remained the final confirmation. At 1120 hours, the first elements of the bomber stream penetrated friendly airspace and descended through layers of thinning cloud toward the English coastline. The dark compression of night yielded to a diluted grey horizon, a light that brought neither relief nor celebration, only the slow return of mechanical reality. Engines continued their measured rotation, airspeed moderated. The rigid geometry of combat formation began its gradual unbinding as navigational responsibility transferred from survival calculus to controlled landing procedure. Inside the Liberator, the environment remained unchanged in temperament. The oxygen flow persisted with faint hiss. Condensation traced narrow arcs along cockpit framing. Frost receded from the glass as altitude relinquished its grip. The pilot did not soften posture. The navigator did not adjust tone. Every movement reflected procedural continuity, as though the mission were not ending, merely transitioning between operational states. Sinclair disconnected the final lead from his oscilloscope and secured the SCR-720 receiver into standby position. The subtle hum dissipated. The lights dimmed. Where electromagnetic chaos had once streamed across phosphorescent lines, there remained only static quiet, a blank surface devoid of false structure and artificial echo. He folded his data logs, aligning edges with precise care, marking the final line with controlled notation. Mission interval complete, coherence nullified, survivability confirmed. Outside, the scattered remnants of artificial formations drifted toward lower atmosphere, diminished by gravity and dissolving into the indifferent flow of air currents. The strips of foil that had summoned entire phantom squadrons now became meaningless fragments, melting into maritime winds, their tactical significance surrendered to ordinary descent. No marker remained of their purpose except the intact aircraft that passed beyond danger. At 1147 hours, the Liberator initiated its final approach vector. Landing gear engaged. Hydraulic systems cycled. The coastline expanded beneath wings that had borne both deception and destruction. The runway extended in silent geometry, its lines awaiting the return of machines long presumed lost by probability. German detection reports at this hour registered anomalies. Internal command traffic identified irregular corridor infiltration and insufficient tracking continuity. Adjective and qualification ruled where certainty had once stood. The language of failure evolved, not through confession, but through passive grammatical realignment. Systems had not failed. Systems had been overwhelmed by statistical pollution. Across briefing halls and airfield huts scattered through the English countryside, senior command officers studied preliminary survivability ratios in disbelief. Aircraft expected to be lost had returned. Crews projected for attrition stood present. Entire squadrons logged serviceable status. The statistical deviation required recalibration of operational confidence thresholds and doctrinal expectation. Sinclair disembarked only after engine shutdown confirmation and voltage stabilization. The air outside touched cold against his uniform. He stepped onto damp concrete without expression. No uniformed officer congratulated him. His contribution did not manifest in gunfire or flames. It rested within waves unseen and patterns erased before comprehension could mature. Later, in the classified evaluation chamber beneath reinforced ceilings, engineers examined the logs he placed upon their tables. Each cycle interval, each amplitude deviation, each drift correction. They traced artificial signatures across frequency analysis grids and observed how German detection logic collapsed into self-contradiction. One scientist whispered the word paradigm not aloud, but faintly, as though truth itself could fracture under excessive recognition. The concept of invisibility redefined itself within that room. No longer concealment, no longer absence. It became distortion, overload, fabrication. It became the act of feeding perception so much truth that truth disintegrated. Sinclair was not assigned accolades. His record bore annotation. Technical influence. Operational efficacy. His presence receded into classification tiers, inaccessible to citation and ceremony. The survival of 300 aircraft required no narrative, only numbers, only silence. Outside, dawn matured over runways still moistened by night air. Ground crews refueled aircraft for subsequent operations. The cycle of war resumed. Engines were cleaned, fuselages inspected. Pilots rested beneath blankets pulled across exhausted shoulders. The illusion of normalcy shielded the magnitude of transformation. In German command centers, review boards convened beneath maps scored with ink and hesitation. Analysts reconstructed tracking sequences and found logic curving inward upon itself. No coherent remedy emerged. What had been lost was not strategic position, but epistemological certainty. The enemy could not be properly seen. That absence reshaped the geometry of future operations. Airspace once ruled by detection now dissolved into probabilistic estimation. The battlefield extended beyond sight, beyond expectation, into domains where perception itself could be manipulated. For Sinclair, the realization arrived without flourish. He removed his gloves, adjusted his collar, stared once at the horizon that had denied meaning to the machines above it. The war would continue, the mathematics would evolve, and the sky would remain no longer an honest witness. The corridor had not been conquered by speed, courage, or ordnance. It had been rewritten, and within its absence of certainty, a silent revolution had begun. Note: all numbers and years written in full words. At 1-2-3-6 hours, the quiet after-action rhythm within the airfield perimeter settled into measured routine. Aircraft lined in disciplined rows. Ground crews moved with methodical patience, their tasks guided by laminated checklists and internal fatigue. The morning light carried no triumph, only procedural normality. Yet beneath the surface of that controlled calm, a subtle rupture had entered the operational doctrine of the air war, an alteration invisible to those who had flown but unmistakable to those who analyzed. Sinclair stood inside the debrief chamber beneath a single overhead lamp, its pale cone of illumination illuminating maps weighted by paperclips and brass instruments. Across from him, technical officers adjusted headphones and calibrated listening equipment to playback captured signal profiles. The air carried the faint scent of machine oil and cold fabric, a sterile echo of the corridor he had traversed hours earlier. He did not speak unless prompted. When required, his voice remained precise and uninflected. He referenced amplitude envelopes. He described correlation delay patterns. He cited release interval parameters and referenced frequency harmonics as though reciting navigational headings. Emotion did not enter his language. Only process. Only consequence. On the wall behind him, a sequence of oscilloscope printouts displayed warped signatures captured from enemy radar returns. Patterns repeated, overlapped, dissolved. One engineer, his spectacles lowered slightly upon his bridge, regarded the distortion with silent respect. The device had not been blinded. It had been confronted with excess perception. More signal than interpretation capacity allowed. The machine, overwhelmed with knowledge, had surrendered function. Across the channel, in unfamiliar territory, German analysts arrived independently at similar conclusions. Their summary employed no dramatic phrasing. Instead, it reflected bureaucratic unease. Observation fidelity corrupted through unexplained proliferation of inconsistent reflections. Such phrasing masked systemic collapse beneath technical understatement. Yet the implication was clear. They could no longer rely upon their eyes within the sky. In that absence, new behaviors emerged. Radar operators hesitated. Fighter controllers questioned vectors. Altitude confirmation required secondary verification. Every delay introduced tolerance, and every tolerance created opportunity for survival. The tempo of reaction slowed. The edge of certainty dulled. Sinclair's role shifted quietly in subsequent days. No longer experimental participant, he became operational architect. His technique transitioned from trial to doctrine. Mission planning now included engineered uncertainty as intentional parameter. The subsequent bomber streams no longer entered corridors alone. They entered statistical shadow spaces designed for distortion. Within successive briefings, Sinclair observed newly assigned officers absorb the methodology. Young lieutenants traced intervals across charts and repeated conditions under instruction. They spoke of reflective density, of signal coherence collapse, of delay as weapon. The language of combat transformed into language of surveillance and counter-surveillance. The enemy no longer merely faced aircraft, they faced perception itself. Outside, the weather altered across daily rotation. Skies clouded. Winds shifted. Yet the corridors carved through airspace no longer conformed to physical geography. They adhered instead to computational weakness and probabilistic drift. Routes were selected not by shortest distance but by optimal deception vector strength. Navigation acquired a new dimension. Sinclair walked the perimeter late that afternoon, boots pressing softly against worn concrete as aircraft taxied past on resupply routes. The engine roar no longer registered as menace. Only context. He regarded one departing formation with detached watchfulness, noting its departure heading and approximate altitude climb pattern. Within its shadow passed another illusion, unseen, unnoted, but shaping the very trajectory of survival. The corridor he had crossed no longer retained its original identity. It had become template. From it evolved not only bypass systems but philosophy. The idea that power lay not solely in destruction but in the alteration of enemy insight changed the architecture of strategic thinking. The dialogue shifted from contact to misperception. Later that evening, reports filtered in from reconnaissance teams monitoring enemy response metrics. Fighter response delay had increased by incremental margins during similar operational windows. Radar sweep synchronization exhibited detectable instability. The intervention had altered expectancy. The enemy now anticipated distortion. In anticipation lay vulnerability. Yet Sinclair understood the transience of advantage. He knew adaptation followed every exposure. Systems evolved. Operators learned. The illusion would not remain invisible forever. It required reinvention, variation, renewal. The discipline did not permit stagnation. He returned to his provisional quarters, a narrow cot beneath a slanted roof where distant aircraft noise merged into muted terrain ambience. The war, though vast, felt momentarily reduced to oscillation patterns and carefully timed reflections. He lay still, eyes closed, his mind tracing interval cycles through imagined grids. The mathematics of misdirection now defined continuity. Outside his window, the night expanded into quiet humility. Stars hovered unnoticed by those who no longer depended upon their light. The sky remained unchanged. But the way it was seen now differed. Somewhere across the same atmosphere, German technicians recalibrated equipment and adjusted reference tables, seeking to reclaim clarity. Their instruments responded with partial correction. But trust did not return. The imprint of doubt remained deeply inscribed. The following morning would bring another briefing, another corridor, another test of invisible space. Yet Sinclair accepted the stillness of this moment not as respite, but as preparation. The war demanded focus not on what could be seen, but on what could be shaped. And in that realization lay the quiet fulcrum upon which entire squadrons balanced between extinction and return.